Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers, is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book, a program of the Minnesota Humanities Commission, with funding provided by Target Stores and the Elmer L. and Eleanor J. Anderson Foundation.
Hi, welcome to Northern Lights. I'm Marcie Rendon, and we're here interviewing Louise Erdrich.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello, Northern Lights. Hello, Marcie.
Good to be here with you. So I wanted to ask you some questions about your books, about your writing, actually.
I've pledged to answer anything you ask. Almost.
Almost. When did you start writing?
Oh, that goes way back, almost 47 years. It's way back in Wahpeton. It was just my birthday yesterday, so I'm time
Happy
conscious.
Birthday.
In June of 2001 here.
Wow.
I started writing when I was pretty young because my parents were the most wonderful, supportive people. My mother made me a little book that she made out of laced together strips of paper, and she would let me draw on it, and then she would write down the words. So she kind of took down the first words, and I remember that book. And then my father would pay me a nickel for writing a story, and I thought that was a really cool way to make money. And I had this great idea about I had this great sense of being able to having permission to write back then, even as a child. But I didn't really start until after I left home, I went to school, I got done with school, and then I came back as a poet in the schools in North Dakota and really decided I had to either write full-time or forget it. I mean, but full-time for me was, I had a lot of jobs to support myself while I was writing. I worked construction, and I was a lifeguard. I was a waitress a lot, here and there, everywhere. And these things later turned out to be great, material for the books, but at the time I thought I would never get through, I would never get through the, I guess you'd call it an apprentice phase, where you would just keep writing and collecting those rejection slips. So that took years and years.
And your home reservation is in North Dakota?
It's in Turtle Mountains. That's where I'm enrolled. But I grew up in Wahpeton, North Dakota. My mother and my father met on the Turtle Mountain Reservation. My dad is German. His name is Ralph Erdrich. My mother's name is Rita Gorno Erdrich, so she's a Gorno from up in the Turtle Mountains. And she and my father taught at a Bureau of Indian Affairs boarding school in Wahpeton, and that's where I grew up with family. There were 7 of us. I'm the oldest, and my sister Hyde is second to the youngest. As she says, I'm vastly older than my sister Hyde. It's
okay.
Yeah, but not more mature. She's always had that on me.
And you grew up in Wahpeton. Your family worked at the boarding school?
Worked at the boarding school, and I didn't leave till I was 18. I really didn't leave. And I think that's something that, well, all of us who grew up there had a very strong attachment to the Great Plains because we spent so much of our time out in the woods and out in the places around the town, and you know, it's a landscape that gets into your soul. It's really in your blood if you've grown up out there.
A lot of that region shows up in your writing.
It does. It does. Yeah, I'm glad to be living where I can at least drive over into the Great Plains. I don't see as much of the sky as I'd like to, but I have that sense that I'm at least on the edge of it.
How do you think that the regional worlds that you create in your stories translate to other Native people across the continent?
Well, I think if there's anything that's pan-Indian, you know, that's common among different reservation communities, and urban communities, of course, it probably is a sense of humor. So if the books have that sense of humor, and I'm really happy about that, because that's what I see as being the familiarity that people have. It's often, even if people are speaking different languages and just have a sense of English in common, there's always a lot of laughter, you know.
We were talking earlier today about growing up in Wapaton.
Yeah.
And going to church.
And going to church.
Right. So can you talk about,
well,
even in your most recent book here, the whole Catholicism and how that seems to run through the different stories?
Well, Catholicism definitely runs through the different stories. And my mother especially, although I shouldn't say this because my dad's a very devout human being too, but I'll give my mother the A+ for devotion. Is a very devout Catholic, and her family is as well. And she and my father raised us in the Catholic Church. So before even going to the Catholic school, we were just knew that we were Catholics. And I think that no matter whether you're a practicing Catholic or not through the rest of your life, you really have a sense of many of the pieces of the symbolism. They're almost haunting. You know, you feel a sort of nostalgia, I guess, for the splendor of the ritual, especially if you've grown up with that Latin Mass and the mystery of it all. And the Catholic Church is big on mysteries, which is one of the things that intrigues a young mind. You know, the continual mystery of the Godhead, you know, the Holy Trinity, the three in one, and they're indivisible and yet they're unique. And you know, and we would ponder over this as kids. And you know, in fact, I still think about it. The other day I was thinking about it as, well, you know, they should have explained it as mother love, I was thinking. Because, you know, we have our children, and each one comes first in our hearts, and yet each one is, you know, individual, and yet, so it's a mystery that I thought, God, they could have explained it that way, you know. But the mystery was always what drew me and was intriguing to me. The mystery in the Mass, the mystery of the transubstantiation, and the big questions. I think, however, and there's an entirely other side to the Catholic Church than the mystery, than the ritual, than the beauty of it. There's an enormous historical cruelty.
Right.
And
that comes through in the books.
And that comes, I think the ambivalence comes through, you know, the dual nature of all that one loves about the Church. It seems to have a flip side, you know, the sort of grace and enigmatic quality of the nuns I grew up with. They dressed in black habits, and the way that they knew exactly how to sweep through your life, and the way that they controlled even their slightest glance. I mean, they were creatures of control and very compelling to a child, and yet women whose power was repressed and thwarted, and women who often rose to, I think, a kind of saintliness, or fell to into a form of powerless abusiveness. So there was, these were very powerful people in my life, and very powerful questions.
And how do you go about weaving those into the story? You mentioned earlier being haunted.
Yeah.
Is that how is it the characters that appear and then haunt you? How do they get woven into the books?
I don't have a precise explanation, because I think that when you're waiting for a story to come, you don't have a lot of choice about what you're going to write. I think it comes and it lands in your lap, and you really have no choice about it. I mean, you can manipulate maybe the time that you're going to write it, or you can devote yourself to giving it time in case it shows up. But the it-ness of it,
right,
is beyond control. It's beyond manipulation. That's why writers are so insecure. For instance, me. I mean, I never know if it's going to happen again tomorrow. If it's hard to have confidence in something that seems so beyond one's personal control. But the Catholicism in the book is really it comes out of that sense of mystery, and the mystery is partly the mystery of the cruelty as well, and the historical relationship between the church and Native people has informed a lot of the work. Hyde and I had a really wonderful grandfather, and Pat Gorno was his name, and he spoke fluent Ojibwe, and he was able to bring together his religion, his traditional religion, and the Catholic religion. I mean, he could, and he found that was welcome at the time in his church, welcome by his priest. So that was certainly a basis of intrigue, and informed a lot of the work in the book. That kind of acceptance, and yet at the same time, my personal memory is of some extremely painful times with some of the nuns who were my teachers, and also some times of great knowledge and grace. So there's this, the work comes out of this dual wonder, and those things that happen to you as a child are really the most powerful, I think. They always come back into the work, and you're always trying to work out those first mysteries.
The other question is about gender roles in your books, particularly in this last one where it's a priest who's really a woman.
In this book is, well, it's not a secret in the book, it's right in the beginning. The priest is a woman who has taken on the role of a priest and felt compelled to do it, not done it as some sort of act of defiance. No, it's very much from the heart. And well, I think all through the other books as well, there are questions about gender and questions about what we are. And she questions in this book, she sort of looks at herself and says, well, was I, in fact, what was I as a woman? Was I created was I creating myself as a woman as much as I'm creating myself as a man, or was I indeed meant to be in that particular, you know, we're in our skin, we're wrapped around our bones. What are we? What are we as people who have to also contend with this this gender in which we find ourselves?
Can you talk about the Antelope Wife and how that story is set in the urban setting?
Yes, I don't know that it's really not a widely known fact that over half of the native people in the country live in cities. But that's not why I wrote it.
And you wrote
but
it.
I said it in an urban place because that's where the characters, again, it's like not really a choice. They were all popping up in an urban setting, and it related to a piece of a beautiful piece of narrative by this woman named Pretty Shield, and it was another one of these little lines that always haunted me, and it was about the antelope people. And she says something like, they're strange, appearing and disappearing on the plains, and yet if you're a man and you see one and you fall in love with one, you're lost forever. So the book is about someone who brings home an antelope woman back from the plains to the city. And it was also a story that I used to tell my girls these, and a lot of it's kind of powwow legend, you know, about the deer woman or the antelope woman who after you're, you know, far gone at a 49 and you look and she lifts her skirts and she's got hooves, you know. And so it was like this, it's a really common story. A lot of different versions of this, but in this book, or not this book, the Antelope Wife book, it's bringing that mysterious piece of history into the contemporary urban setting and finding that it still hasn't lost. We still don't have all the answers.
Right.
Yeah. Also, there's in a lot of the books there are always Germans and Americans, and in the books, especially the Beat Queen, and in the Antelope Wife, there's something called a Blitzkuchen, and it's this phenomenal, legendary German cake, and it's a taste that cannot quite be replicated because it involves a certain emotion that the taster has to be experiencing at the same time, and perhaps in typical German fashion, that emotion turns out to be fear.
Oh, okay.
But a lot of the time, I'm working from both sides, I think, of my background. But I don't think that the German side gets as much play. You know, it works in, though, all of the time. And there's certainly a very solid German sense of sometimes history and sometimes Midwestern history in the books.
Yeah.
And of certain, and often of cooking.
So what is this cake made of?
What is this cake made of? Fear.
I wanted to ask you about Birch Bark House, which is your children's book.
Yeah.
And your artwork in there.
Okay, well, I have to attribute that book's genesis to my mother and my sister Louise, who did this incredible research into the origins of our family, and found out about the origins on Madeline Island, where this book is set. So the book was really inspired by the wish I have to trace our family's route across Minnesota to the Turtle Mountains. And eventually this book will be part of maybe 10 books, maybe. Well, I want to get up to the Turtle Mountains
Where you
part.
want to get there.
Yeah, I want to get there. So, and you're asking about the drawings, and I never had any confidence in those drawings, but I knew that if I worked with an artist that I would just be snapping pictures of the things I have around the house and sending them to the artist. I had an idea of how I wanted everything to look. You know, there's little moccasin in there, and there's macaques. There's a lot of objects that I could draw from around the house. But there's also the way the kids looked, and I had been snapping pictures of my own kids for years. Some people said, "Gee, that kid in there looks a lot like Louise," but it's my children, because I would take them in different poses, and then I could draw from the snapshots. So it was a long time in the making, and that's what it's from. They're real home-drawn kind of things. They're really fun.
They're sweet. They're really
Thank
sweet.
you. Yeah, it's an unacknowledged sweet part of my nature, that sweetness. Otherwise, it's just all darkness and gloom.
I know that you're learning Ojibwe, or relearning Ojibwe, and that you use words, phrases in your writing.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you do that?
I'm learning. I didn't ever speak Ojibwe.
Okay.
Yeah, and really have only the memory of my grandfather's Ojibwe. Really knew very few words. So I started trying to learn through tapes when I lived in New Hampshire, and found that extremely difficult. You know, you can kind of come up with Anina Jayai, and I mean, then you think, oh God, and then you want to use it on somebody, and there's nobody there. You're kind of talking to yourself, and
I'm wondering if you have the pronunciation right.
No, you don't know. So you keep talking back and forth with this tape. So I thought I knew Basil Johnson really well. I keep talking to this tape, you know. But but having moved here, I found really fortunate, because I got to know a wonderful teacher. Now is his name. Jim Clark, a Mille Lacs elder, and his wife Jessie Clark, who still teaches at Four Winds. And the two of them are wonderful speakers and just great people. And I have to thank them enormously, as well as Dennis Jones, Pipon Benes, and Pagagoit Kamagok, his wife Lorraine Jones. And they teach at the university, and then through this language table where Rick Greshik has been teaching, and you know, there's a number of extraordinary teachers in the city, and people who really want to pursue the language and learn it. So I feel fortunate. There's such a good community here, and so I've, as I said, studied, and every so often I think, well, have I got to the level of a 4-year-old yet? And then I'll hear a 4-year-old say something, and I go, I can't say that. You know, it's really hard. It's for some of the viewers. I mean, I guess we could just speak a little bit about Ojibwe, because it's one of the questions is why, in the first place, learn a language that isn't your.
When you're writing in English.
When you're writing in English, and when in fact I have to say, you know, I was more familiar in my daily life with German because my father spoke German. My mother did not grow up speaking Ojibwe, or spoke some, but really didn't have the confidence because, you know, at that time, the language was just beaten out of people. It just, you know, beaten out of people. And people didn't want their kids to learn it. People wanted their kids, they didn't want their kids to suffer the same ignominy and humiliation they'd suffered. And so they didn't speak it or ask their kids to speak it. But the language itself, I think, it's one of the hardest languages. It's in the Guinness Book of World Records as being one of the toughest languages, right? And it's all verbs. And there's like 6,000 forms for every verb. It's just amazing. Right. And it's a language of hard work. That's how I look at it. It's a language of hard work and not very many nouns because people didn't have a lot of stuff.
Right.
And it's a beautiful language. And speaking of gender, there's no gender designation in this language. You don't have to know if a person's a woman or a man or a thing, like in French is female or male. All you need to know is if it's alive or dead. Doesn't that make more sense? You know, if it's dead or alive. Animate, inanimate. And yet, the interesting thing about that is some things that in English would be considered inanimate, say a stone, is alive. It's alive in Ojibwe. And it's our grandfather, it's our grandmother. And it gives one a whole different view of the universe, I think. Ojibwe is a language that embraces this part of the world, knows every corner of this world, has named our landscape already. And when we speak in English, we aren't speaking to the land. We aren't speaking to the land that has produced this language, because people learned the real names of things in this landscape through dreams that were then translated into sounds and language. And if Ojibwe dies, we won't have a way to describe what's around us. And that's why the language is so vital and important, and it's so important to keep this language going.
Okay. We're running out of time. Is there anything that you wanted to talk about during this interview?
I guess I want to talk about the language. That is, and I also want to thank the community here in Minnesota, and thank my family, and thank my teachers, and say miigwech nindinawe maganidok, and thank all relatives, and especially, let's say I have a big thank you for the readers here in Minnesota. This is a place where people read, and I'm proud to live here.
And what are you working on now?
Well, it is from the German side. It's a book called The Master Butcher's Singing Club, and it's really not about my German family at all, but or the background, but it is about. It was inspired by this letter that my grandmother wrote back from Germany that talked about my grandfather reuniting after he'd come over here in the 20s, and he went back in the 50s to reunite with the members of the Master Butcher's Singing Club. And who could resist it, you know? Thought of all these Master Butchers in full voice.
Congregating from all over the world.
Yeah. So that's what the book is.
Thank you, Louise, and thank Birch Bark Books for having us here today. Thank you, audience, for joining Northern Lights today.
Thanks.
Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers, is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book, a program of the Minnesota Humanities Commission, with funding provided by Target Stores and the Elmer L. and Eleanor J. Anderson Foundation.